So Valve, with its Steam Deck, is really killing it right now, and not just because of the Steam Deck. Now, the Steam Deck OLED, which this is not, this is one of the original Steam Decks, the Steam Deck OLED is an absolutely beloved device. People love the screen, people love the form factor, people love playing their PC games in a portable way, and SteamOS right now is the best operating system to do that because of the interface, not so much because of the actual compatibility. There are still, a little bit of issues here and there with SteamOS and playing games that were designed for Windows, especially if you're trying to branch out of Steam's ecosystem, but for the most part, it's gonna get you by, especially with single-player games, but more and more with multiplayer games. And now that Valve is starting to bring SteamOS to non-Steam Deck machines, there's a lot of talk about whether or not Windows days as the undisputed PC gaming platform are numbered. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. Now, first and foremost, I am not one that actually thinks that Windows days are super numbered. Like, there's been a ton of talk online about this being the year of Linux, and we've heard that, well, basically every year for the past several years, decades, probably even before I was a PC gamer, which now is well over 10 years. So I don't necessarily think Windows is going anywhere soon, especially on a desktop setup like I'm sitting at right now, because the fact of the matter is SteamOS does still have compatibility issues, especially for games that deal with anti-cheat software. It's not particularly well supported. That is, Linux is not particularly well supported by those anti-cheat softwares. And there are some workarounds and some actual things that you can do in SteamOS that actually gets some of those working properly, but we're not there yet. Compatibility-wise, if SteamOS is to take on Windows, it has to be able to do so in multiplayer games. But that being said, for people, especially people that are largely single-player gamers, and they're trying to get away from Windows, this is pretty big. SteamOS moving to non-Steam Deck devices is a big deal, especially when SteamOS starts showing up on desktop computers, because Valve doesn't necessarily care about making money on SteamOS like Microsoft cares about making money on Windows. Valve just wants to sort of funnel people into its ecosystem, because that's ultimately where it makes its money, is through Steam and the Steam store. Now, that being said, a segment that's starting to take off as much more viable with modern APUs, thanks AMD for that, by the way, the handheld market, which obviously was pioneered, at least in its modern iteration, by Nintendo, but the handheld PC market is really starting to take off as a new segment for gaming. And in that regard, Microsoft doesn't want to be left out. And if everyone is running through SteamOS, then Microsoft is going to be missing out on at least some sales through its own storefront, because everyone's going to be going through SteamOS, everyone's going to be using Steam, and you can use third-party launchers in SteamOS, but there's a little bit of getting them up and running, some configuration that the end user has to do. So for most people that just want to hop on a system and game, SteamOS right now is by far and away the best platform. So Microsoft, I would expect, is eventually going to push back and try to get their own system up and running to compete with SteamOS. And I don't know if that's going to be just making a new Windows UI for mobile-like devices like this. We saw Windows sort of try this back with Windows 8, and it was not great. So we'll see if they go that route. Or one of the suggested routes that has been sort of floating out there is that Microsoft might be looking to sort of merge Xbox and Windows truly together. And in that scenario, there might be a future where there's like an Xbox OS where on mobile, like this, like a Steam Deck-like machine, you boot it up, but it's just an Xbox interface, and maybe that would be available to like HTPCs as well, and maybe that would even be something that you could install on any PC that you wanted to, and then if you had a PC you wanted to serve as a console, you could install the Xbox version of Windows, or whatever you want to call it, and it would run that sort of controller, console-friendly type of interface that currently is just unavailable on Windows. Now, among tech heads, there seems to be an overwhelming majority that are really rooting for SteamOS to take hold and Linux gaming to finally take off. And maybe this is the push that Linux gaming needs. And if you get a large enough install base of SteamOS, then developers are going to start to think of Linux as a sort of port option that they need to make from the get-go. That is, make their games natively for Linux. And I think that's where the Steam Deck's ultimate success would be, is if they can push developers into developing for Linux specifically. The bad news with all that is, as long as Microsoft owns so many game studios, which it does, Windows is still going to be the place that they're going to be developing a lot of their games. And unless you can get yourself away from all of those studios, and unless developers really hop on board with this idea of Linux first and not so much as an afterthought, then ultimately I don't think Windows is going anywhere as generally speaking, the dominant PC platform. But if developers do start to move to Linux and do start developing native games and do start supporting multiplayer, which hopefully with a larger handheld base they will, because people will want to play their multiplayer games that require anti-cheat software, they'll still want to be playing those in their handhelds. So if a large enough user base develops as a result of the Steam Deck or Lenovo's Legion Go or the Asus handhelds, or just generally all the other handhelds that are being pumped out, then hopefully developers at least start giving Linux its due support. And if they do, people like you or me that may actually want to move away from Microsoft and away from Windows may actually finally have a viable way of doing that. Because the reality is, I would have loved to have moved away from Windows years and years ago, but as a gamer, that's never been a feasible option. And while we're not quite there yet, especially for those of us that run NVIDIA graphics cards like I do, we are getting closer and closer, and that's really exciting. So no, I don't think Windows days as the dominant gaming platform are particularly numbered, but at the same time, I don't think Microsoft should feel as comfortable and safe as they always have in the past, because now there's actually a legitimate x86 challenger coming in with handhelds and likely in the future actual desktop machines that are going to be running an operating system that is actually competing directly against Microsoft and its Windows OS. So I'm hopeful that the competition at least pushes Microsoft to make some changes to Windows that make it both cheaper, as well as make it more stable, as well as make it more friendly to mobile-focused devices. Because if all those things happen, even if SteamOS never replaces Windows as the dominant platform, Valve isn't exactly losing. Steam is still the crazy popular platform that it currently is, and consumers end up winning because you get a cheaper Windows operating system that may actually end up being better for the competition, because ultimately, competition is good for the consumer. And that's what we're finally starting to see with SteamOS now moving outside of the Steam Deck. So even if Valve doesn't ultimately displace Windows as the new go-to platform for PC gamers, we still win if there's competition in the space. And that's ultimately what I'm really excited to see in 2025 and beyond. It may not be the year of Linux totally, but Linux is definitely moving in the right direction with SteamOS, or rather, SteamOS is pushing Linux in the right direction for gamers. So, what do you think about this? What do you think about SteamOS? What do you think about Windows and the possible competition? Microsoft maybe better supporting handheld form factors? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'm Shane with Who's Your Hardware, and I will see you all in the next video.